They told him he'd never walk again. But that morning, he danced, no applause, no music, just trembling legs, hospital socks on cold tile, and the sound of a clipboard hitting the floor. One nurse gasped, another backed away, and me? I just stood there, completely shattered. A doctor, paralyzed by awe. How ironic is that, but let me go back. Because if you think this is a story of healing, you're wrong. This is a story about guilt, grit, and a boy who refused to die, even when his spine did. His name was Jayden, 17, high school track star. Had that kind of smile that made nurses pause mid-sentence. And one night, he jumped off a garage roof on a dare. Not to hurt himself, just to prove something. And what he proved was how fast a spinal cord can rupture. They wheeled him in during my night shift. I remember the hallway lights flickering above us, his mother clutching his shoe like it was a rosary. Jayden kept trying to move, trying to prove he still could, but his legs, they didn't even twitch. Spinal contusion, the scans read. Bruised cord, incomplete, meaning maybe he'd walk again. But I knew the odds. I've seen that chart 100 times. Most kids never stand again. And yet, something about him, he looked at me like he dared me to give up. Rehab was brutal. I won't sugarcoat it. He screamed through it, cried, refused to try, then begged to try again. He hated me, then trusted me, then hated me again. But there was this one morning, early, cold. I walked into the therapy room with my coffee still shaking in my hand. Jayden was already standing. No braces, no walker, just standing. And then he moved, one step, two, and then I don't even know what to call it. He danced, not like a performance, not clean. His knees buckled, his arms flailed. But it was a dance, the kind that only someone who's seen death can do. I forgot to breathe. I forgot who I was, because all I could think was, what if we were wrong about him? But that wasn't the ending. It was just the beginning. Because the moment we celebrated, something darker was already unfolding, and I didn't see it coming. I've seen a lot of 17-year-olds in the trauma bay. Gunshot wounds, car accidents, overdoses. But I remember the exact moment Jayden Hale was wheeled through those doors. Not because he looked like he was dying, but because he didn't. He was awake, alert, breathing on his own, and yet completely still from the waist down. It was 2:34 a.m., fluorescent lights humming above, the smell of antiseptic and rain-soaked asphalt wafting off his clothes. He was soaked to the skin, gravel embedded in his elbows. His hair was plastered to his forehead. I remember because he looked me straight in the eye and said, "I'm fine." "You're not fine, kid. You just haven't realized it yet." They said he'd jumped from a garage roof. A dare, a laugh, a girl watching. That sickening mix of teenage invincibility and male ego. We don't warn boys about gravity until it's too late. The EMTs couldn't feel a pulse in his feet. He couldn't wiggle his toes. He kept trying, though. God, he kept trying. I ordered the CT scan before the nurse even finished checking his reflexes. Spinal contusion at T12. Bone fragments compressing the cord, no obvious transection. That was the only silver lining. I sat beside his mother in the family consult room, the one with peeling paint and a fake plant in the corner. She was clutching her son's shoe, just one. The laces soaked, like she'd pulled it from a flood. "What does incomplete mean?" she asked. Her voice didn't shake. That's how I knew she was in shock. I told her the truth. It means we don't know yet. It means he might walk again. It also means he might not. And I watched the hope drain out of her eyes like air escaping a balloon. Jayden refused surgery, said he didn't want metal in his back. I told him the metal might help him walk again. He told me he didn't want to walk if he had to be a robot. Teenage logic. It sounds ridiculous until you remember how fragile identity is at that age. We stabilized him. Pain meds, steroids, strict spinal precautions. He laid there with that damned smile like it was a joke, like he didn't believe it was real yet. But the next morning, reality arrived. Hard. He woke up screaming, couldn't feel his thighs, couldn't move his hips, couldn't pee on his own. And that's when I saw the first crack in him. Not when he jumped, not when he heard spinal injury, but when a nurse had to catheterize him in front of his mom. He begged us to stop, tried to cover himself, tried to pretend it didn't matter, but it did. It mattered more than the walking, because that was the first moment he felt powerless. Over the next week, I visited him every morning before rounds. Same room, same smell, bleach and plastic, a TV he never turned on, a call button he never pressed. He stopped eating, stopped talking, wouldn't look anyone in the eye. So I sat beside him. And one morning I said, "What's your biggest fear?" He looked at me for a long time, eyes glassy, and he whispered, "That I'll never feel like a man again." And that's when I knew. Jayden didn't just need rehab, he needed a reason, something more than walking, something more than proving people wrong. He needed to know he still mattered, and I didn't know how to give him that. Not yet, but I promised myself I would find a way. Because if he didn't walk again, if he never walked again, at least I wanted him to stand for something, but none of us knew what was really coming, not him, not me, not even his mother. Because sometimes what breaks you isn't the fall. It's what comes after. People think recovery starts when the pain stops. That's a lie. Recovery starts when the pain becomes routine. Jayden's war didn't begin in the operating room, or even on that rooftop. It began in his quadriceps, when he tried to move them and nothing happened. Not a twitch, not a shiver, just silence, muscle silence. And let me tell you, that silence screams louder than any monitor. The first day of rehab was brutal. Even the elevator ride down felt like descending into a battlefield. He didn't want to go. I practically begged him. I told him, "You don't have to run today, you just have to show up." He didn't believe me, of course. Teenagers are allergic to hope when they think it's been poisoned. The therapy room smelled like rubber mats and menthol cream. You could hear the low thump of resistance bands snapping against calloused hands. Other patients groaned. Some laughed through tears. But Jayden didn't speak. Not once. He sat in the wheelchair like it was a coffin, his legs strapped, his fists clenched. He was ready for war, but he was already defeated. "All right, Jayden," I said gently. "Let's try ankle dorsiflexion. Lift your foot toward your shin, just a little." He stared at his foot. You know that look people give the dead at funerals? That's the look he gave his own foot. Try again. Nothing. Try again. Still nothing. Jayden. His lip trembled, and then he laughed, a cold, bitter laugh. "I can't even move my damn toe. You think I'm gonna dance?" I wanted to argue, to give him science, data, hope. But instead I knelt beside him, rested my hand over his and said, "Not today, but maybe next month, or maybe never. But we fight anyway." Because that's what this was. Not healing, not recovery, it was war. And the enemy wasn't his injury. It was the voice in his head saying, "You are useless." That voice is harder to kill than any diagnosis. The weeks crawled. Every inch of progress cost him pain. He learned to transfer to a chair. He learned how to slide on a board. He cried when he finally sat on a toilet without help. You think dignity is about standing tall? It's not. It's about reclaiming choice. even when that choice is something as small as wiping your own tears. And me? I was there every day. I showed up when the therapist couldn't get through. I pushed when he wanted to quit. I celebrated when his left quad twitched for the first time. You would have thought he won the Super Bowl. But here's the thing, no one tells you. Progress isn't a straight line. It's jagged, cruel. Some days you gain, some days you lose everything you gained. And one afternoon, he did. Jayden had been improving. Tiny steps, tiny hope, and then his body collapsed mid-transfer. He fell, hard, hit his shoulder on the bed frame. His mom screamed. He didn't. He just stared up at the ceiling like the stars had betrayed him. I knew it, he whispered. It was all a joke. I carried him back to the chair myself. That night, I sat alone in the locker room for over an hour, staring at my own hands, wondering if I was helping or torturing him. But the next morning, he showed up, with bruises, with resentment, with rage. But he showed up. And sometimes, that's enough to win a battle. Not the war, not yet, but a battle. Some patients heal because they believe. Others, because they suffer enough to have no choice. Jayden didn't believe in much anymore. Not in his body, not in medicine, not in me. And honestly, I didn't blame him. By the third week, his progress had plateaued. The honeymoon phase of maybe it'll come back had ended. Now, it was just work. Hard, humiliating, relentless work. He hated every second. And that morning, he refused to speak at all. He sat on the mat table, arms crossed, jaw clenched, eyes locked on the ground like if he looked up, something would break. The therapist asked him to try bridging, lifting his hips off the mat. He didn't move, didn't even blink. I stepped in. Jayden, I said softly, you don't have to succeed. You just have to try. He turned toward me, eyes like broken glass, and said, flatly, without even a whisper of emotion, why? So you can write it in your chart? Patient attempted movement, failed, encouraged. I've had a lot of patients snap at me, but something in his tone wasn't anger. It was resignation, like the war inside him had gone quiet. So I sat down, not across from him, next to him, shoulder to shoulder, close enough to hear him breathing. I had a patient once, I began. She was paralyzed from the chest down, didn't move for 8 months, didn't smile for 3, and then, one day, she sneezed, hard, and her toe twitched. Jayden didn't react. But that twitch, it became her religion. She built her entire fight around it, and she walked out of here 9 months later. Still no reaction. So I leaned closer. Do you know what her turning point was? He finally looked at me. Slightly. A fraction. Pain, I said. She started to feel real pain, and that's when we knew the nerves were waking up. Jayden, if you're in pain, that means the war's not over. It means you still have soldiers left inside you. He didn't say anything, but he lay back on the mat, positioned his feet, and whispered, barely audible, tell me what to do. And so we began again. Bend your left knee just a centimeter. He strained, his breath caught, forehead damp, veins bulging in his neck. No movement, but his whole body shook. That tremble? That's what made me believe again. The next few days were pure torment. Each movement demanded fire from his muscles. He'd cry from frustration more than pain, but he kept showing up, and then came the breakthrough. I remember it because it was raining again, same gray sky, same buzzing fluorescent lights. He was doing assisted squats in the harness frame. Sweat pouring, breath ragged, therapist guiding his hips down, and then, midway through the rep, he locked eyes with me, and I saw it before I understood it. His legs weren't just responding, they were initiating. He wasn't being lifted, he was standing. Jayden, I said, voice cracking. "Are you pushing up?" He didn't answer, just let out this guttural, breathless growl, somewhere between a scream and a sob, and forced himself to full extension, fully upright, arms trembling, harness barely holding him, tears in his eyes, and then he smiled, not a cocky smile, not the one from before. A new smile, like he'd just touched something holy. "I did that," he whispered. "I did that." And all I could do was nod. Because the truth was I didn't have words, not as a doctor, not even as a human. Pain had become his teacher. And finally, he was listening. They say the first steps are sacred. They lie. The first steps are terrifying. Because when you've fallen that far, you don't trust the floor anymore. Jayden's first full day upright was a storm of chaos. Not in the hospital, but inside him. He didn't tell anyone it was coming, not even me. But when I walked into the therapy room that morning, he was already in the frame, harnessed, trembling, drenched in sweat. No techs, no therapist, just him. Alone. I froze. The lights flickered behind him, rain tapping against the window like it wanted in. And Jayden, he looked like a ghost fighting to re-enter his own body. Then I saw it. His left leg moved forward, not dragged, lifted. My heart skipped, then the right, then again and again. I stepped closer, slowly, whispered, "Jayden, what are you doing?" He didn't stop, didn't look up, just kept walking in place. Legs buckling, arms flailing slightly for balance, until finally he turned his head toward me and said, voice ragged, "I don't want to walk anymore. I want to scream." I didn't respond because I understood this wasn't about mobility. This was rage. This was trauma leaking through his bones. And then he spun. Clumsy. Violent. A half twist that made the harness jolt. He moved like his body was trying to outrun itself. A wild, almost primal burst. Knees jerking, feet slapping the ground. Not in rhythm, not graceful, but unmistakably dancing. I stood frozen. It wasn't beautiful, it wasn't even coherent. But it was his. A boy who was supposed to be paralyzed was dancing like something inside him had to burn. The nurses stepped in. One dropped a clipboard. Another just whispered, "Oh my God." And I cried, right there, in my scrubs. With the hospital badge around my neck and 10 years of medical training in my pocket. I cried like a child. Because it wasn't the movement that broke me. It was his face. He wasn't smiling, he wasn't proud, he looked angry, heartbroken, exhausted, and beneath all of it was relief. As if the storm inside him had finally found its body. When he collapsed into the harness, gasping, I rushed forward. He was drenched, fists clenched, head tilted up toward the ceiling like he was yelling at God through his thoughts. I gently touched his shoulder. He flinched, then relaxed, and then he said, barely breathing, "That wasn't for celebration, Doc. That was for him." I didn't understand. "Him who?" I asked. His voice cracked, his eyes welled. "The kid who jumped." Suddenly it hit me. He hadn't forgiven himself. Not yet. Not for the roof, not for the silence, not for his mother's tears, or the wheelchair, or the way people pitied him in the hallways. That dance wasn't a rebirth. It was a funeral. For the boy he used to be. And then he laughed. A crooked, breathless kind of laugh that made my chest ache. "You thought I was celebrating, didn't you?" he said, looking up at me. Mascara streaks from his mother's last visit still faint on his shirt. "Nah, that was grief, Doc." Grief finally found a rhythm. I nodded. Because there was nothing else to say. No prescription, no protocol, no recovery chart, just me, a doctor. Standing beside a 17-year-old boy who had just danced for the version of himself that never came home. The room was silent. Not the kind of silence that heals, but the kind that hums just beneath your skin. After Jayden's dance, no one spoke. Not the therapists, not the nurses, not even his mother. She stood in the doorway, hands over her mouth, as if watching her son rise from the dead. And Jayden? He just hung limp in the harness, like he'd released something ancient. And now there was nothing left. I escorted him back to his room myself. He didn't look at me, didn't say a word. I think part of me hoped he'd break into a smile, maybe even laugh about it. But he didn't. The dance had drained him. Not his body, his soul. Sometimes I forget that recovery is a kind of grief. Grieving the version of yourself that never comes back. Over the next few days, Jayden withdrew again. No more therapy, no outbursts, no anger, just silence. He lay in his bed with the blinds drawn, the TV off, the food untouched. And when I'd walk in, he'd close his eyes like even being seen was too much. It scared me more than any drop in vitals ever could. Because when a fighter stops fighting, there's a kind of death that medicine can't measure. I tried everything. Stories, data, even humor. Nothing reached him. Until one night, I was on my way out, coat half on, when I passed his room, and I heard something. Click, click, click. I opened the door slowly. He was sitting in the dark, with a metronome on his tray table. The old kind, mechanical, ticking back and forth like a clock that had forgotten what time meant. "Jayden," I said. He didn't look up. "Where did you get that?" Still no answer, just the ticking. Then, without warning, he whispered, "If I can dance, but I still feel nothing, does it count?" I stepped closer. "What do you mean?" He finally turned his head, eyes red, voice empty. I thought the movement would fix it, but it didn't. I'm still gone. And that's when I realized. We'd focused so much on his body, we forgot his mind was still bleeding. Jayden didn't need legs, he needed meaning, something to come back to. And I didn't have it. Not in my training, not in my charts, not even in my words. So I sat beside him. And for the first time in my career, I didn't offer hope. I offered presence. We listened to the metronome tick together. One beat, then the next. And maybe that was enough. He was discharged 3 weeks later. Walking, yes, but hollow. His mother smiled, waved at the nurses. But Jayden, he didn't look back. I never saw him again, not until this morning. I was on my way to rounds, same hallway, same hospital, and there he was, older, taller, hair shaved short, no limp. He didn't see me at first. He was wheeling a gurney into the elevator. Orderly badge on his chest, stethoscope in his pocket, not because he needed it, but because he belonged. I called his name, he paused, turned, smiled, faintly. "Doc," he said, "didn't think you still worked here." I wanted to hug him, or cry, or say something poetic, but I just nodded and said, "How are you?" He shrugged. Still learning to feel things, but I moved forward. And just before the elevator doors closed, he leaned in. It was never about walking, Doc. It was about not disappearing. That's when I knew. The silence that followed his dance wasn't peace. It was rebirth. And some people don't scream when they're born, they just arrive. He didn't walk back into life. He carved a new one, step by trembling step.